What I will do is I've just started recording, and I'm just gonna say that neither of us slept more than a few hours, and we have no plan whatsoever about what we're going to talk about. So there is no guarantee that today will be interesting, or it might be more interesting than ever.
You're revealing our secrets now.
No secrets. I'm not revealing any secrets. All I'm saying is that we're just both sleep deprived. It's 7:49 a.m. on August the 19th, 2020. I listened to two great podcasts on the way over here. I was driving the last few hours, and you know Sean Carroll,
Yeah.
Caltech.
Mindscape.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's
Yeah,
got a
listen
great
to that.
podcast.
Yeah,
I definitely
yeah.
like. I was all about complexity, and then my friend Chris Ryan, who wrote Sex at Dawn and Civilized to Death, he's got a podcast named Tangentially Speaking. And anyway, people who are looking for podcasts and maybe curious about our influences, what helped give birth to this podcast. So what are you thinking about this morning, Patrick? I'm gonna punt the ball to you.
So I was in the Go Club back at Berkeley. You know Go, the game Go.
Yeah.
And a world-renowned Japanese Go player was going to come through Berkeley, and everyone was all excited that he was going to come. And they had set it up so that he was going to play the top-ranked, I think at the time, the top-ranked American, or maybe the top-ranked American that people knew of. There could have been a professional somewhere in the mix, and they were so excited to have this Japanese guest and visitor that the first thing they did when he got from the airport, so they had set up a game that night to be played amongst the highest ranked American and this Japanese visiting professional. And oh man. And so I've even told the story before. You could tell it's rehearsed. You could tell I'm struggling. But luckily the point of the story, I don't mean to spoil it, is about the cognitive performance gains by being a little bit hungover and a little bit drunk. So the guy shows up at the airport, the Japanese Go player, and they get so excited. They take him out for dinner. They take him out for drinks. They want to wine and dine, just to be good hosts and everything. And they decide the game is supposed to be the next day. And they decide in the excitement and splendor to have the game that night. And the Japanese guy has gotten very drunk right off the plane, jet lag, just extremely drunk. And everyone's like, "Oh, it's great. It's going to be fair. It's going to be, it's going to equalize the skill level, perhaps."
Right.
And they play the game that night, and the Japanese guy completely and utterly destroys, humiliates the best American at Go. And he wakes up in the morning, and he's so ashamed. He's hungover, and he's ashamed. And he's like, "Oh my God, I can't believe that happened." The Japanese guy. This is what the morning after, the walk of shame is
Yeah.
You've obliterated someone at Go. And
He should have beat him more politely.
he should have beat him more politely. So all being drunk did. Well, hello. Today's
We're in the desert.
quite a day.
Yeah.
It
It got rid of his manners, huh?
got rid of his manners.
So interesting.
Instead of equalize his skill level, it just made him not mind completely destroying.
So this
Because
is
usually when you are a little bit better than someone, you have manners. There's a polite way in which you beat them slightly above their level. So it's a teaching moment for everybody.
So this is so interesting. We always can. There's an endless minefield to take from when it comes to being in the world itself. I thought that the title might have been a bit arbitrary, or maybe just more broadly about being in the world, but it does seem that we keep coming back to it a little bit. And Dreyfus used to talk about the way Japanese and American babies are socialized is not an explicit thing about, rules about what it is, what you're supposed to do, not do, but there are just embodied cues that are given. And I think one example he would give is that babies in America are put on their stomachs more often, which makes them want to crawl around. And Japanese babies were more often put on their backs, which made them more receptive to the world, right? And this, or distant standing cues. You're not taught you have to stand 3 feet away from somebody, but if you're in a culture where people stand closer together, you have a tendency to back off a little bit, or if you're, vice versa. And my other big influence on this podcast is the Dick Cavett show. And since I love chess so much, I remember the Bobby Fischer episode. And Dick Cavett asks Bobby Fischer, who was at the time the top ranked player in the world, and who had learned not amongst like the clubs like they had in Russia, but on his own and playing in the park in Washington Square Park. And he said, what is it that makes you love chess the most? Is it like coming up with a clever, combination? Is it the beauty of the game? Is it the history? Like there's all these possibilities. And he says, it's watching my opponent's ego get crushed. And so I think that's the exact opposite tale that you're telling of the Japanese. And it really points to the differences and priorities, I think, between different cultures. And I think that one of the fundamental ideas in being in the world and in Heidegger and Dreyfus and everything is that, and in existentialism, the slogan is existence precedes essence, right? So that there is no essential quality to being human. What it is to be human is changes as groundless, and it changes from time to time and from culture to culture. And I think these are great examples of that.
There's this documentary I watched on the cleanup after Fukushima, the Fukushima nuclear accident in Japan. And it's like a totally uninhabitable zone. But yet still they have kind of cleaners and maintenance people that go in and check on the health of the reactor as it's cooling down very, very slowly. And they still had the electric grid appeared to be up. So this guy was driving through a ghost town. Total ghost town. 0 people. It's literally a nuclear fallout zone. And there's a red light, and the Japanese guy comes to the red light and he stops. And he waits. And the film, I think brilliantly pauses on him and just pauses for the amount of time that he waits at this red light. He waits at the red light in a nuclear fallout zone. And there's something about kind of like task-specific tolerance and manners and these kinds of things that are so different. I couldn't imagine. If I come to a red light, I'll make a right turn and then a U-turn and then a very quick right on red just to get around it.
Same. And in Naples, of course, they don't even stop. I remember a friend of mine was on a bus in Naples, and the bus ran the red light, and they said, "How do you actually work for the city not even follow the advice?" And he's like, that's exactly why it's a piece of advice. He said the light, not un consiglio, a counsel. But they're seen in Italy as a bit of especially in the south of Italy, as a bit of an idiot. The same as in New York, if you stopped at a don't walk sign, like if you stood on the corner and waited for the light to turn green to walk, this kind of relationship to rules. It's interesting because according to the Heideggerian model, like it means you're more skilled if you don't follow the rules, if you've embodied and incorporated them, if you know the rules and then can break them. In a way, it's a sign of more advanced skill than someone who just follows the rules, because the rules are general and the situation is specific. So do you think that that certain cultures that follow rules too closely, does it stop them from becoming as skilled? I wonder about this. Maybe not. Maybe the level is just higher.
I consider it, at least on my act, kind of barbaric to flout the rules like that, where I do the right turn on red, U-turn, right turn on red. I don't know what it would look like to be a skilled member of society in a way that you can be a skilled flamenco guitarist or pianist. I do think about this sometimes in terms of if you look at the non-genetic risk factors for schizophrenia, the number one is being a migrant, which is very, very it's unexplained in the mental health field. There are all kinds of theories, but it's being a migrant. And I think what that has to do is the fact that a migrant by definition has started in one culture and ended up in the other. And a lot of these kinds of rules, whether or not you're put on your stomach or your side, social distancing, tolerance for a top-down enforcement, all kinds of things. These are there are probably like tens of thousands of unspoken rules in a society that can look abnormal if you're from outside. Yeah. And when we have no biomarkers, we have no way of diagnosing mental illnesses except for behavioral abnormalities. So I think one explanation for why migrant is the number one non-genetic risk factor for schizophrenia is that all these rules build up kind of unspoken in society. And when your goal as a psychiatrist or doctor is to observe and look for abnormality, you're going to see it sometimes in migrants more. You're making
me think, it's funny. I talk about Italians flouting rules, like they don't stand in line and they don't stop at the red lights. But God, if you look at the rules that they just would not dare, and they would look at you with absolute horror if you break around food. I mean, God forbid you put Parmesan on a pasta dish that has raw tomatoes, like alla checca, which is like sliced tomatoes with olive oil and basil. If you put Parmesan on that, they will look at you with absolute horror. like you've blasphemed in some way, you know. And this is not written down anywhere, but it is a serious fucking rule for the Italians. Things like there's all these manners that, you know, about arguing. You see it even more in Middle Eastern cultures, I think, about like arguing who's going to pay. You know, even if you know, or in Ireland with gift giving, like, here, I like your shirt. Here, you can have it. No, don't give it to me. Yes, I mean it. You can have it. And there's this back and forth, and it has to go back and forth 6 or 7 times before the real intent of the person is given. If somebody said, "Oh yeah, thanks, you're gonna give it to me," that would be super rude, you know. And if you didn't offer. So these are just, I think they go partly hand in hand with a culture being older. And therefore, maybe it does have more skill at being, because it's had thousands of years to like work out these nuances. Whereas in American culture, maybe that is more explicitly rule governed. It's because it's a culture of migrants that had to make explicit rules and hasn't had the time to mature enough to break them in this more nuanced way, maybe.
Yeah.
Just thinking out loud. But
in like, I think 2008 or 2009, I spent some time investigating the art of schizophrenics. There's a mental hospital in Lausanne, Switzerland. And they have what's called an open campus for their mental hospital, where first of all, it's art therapy. So people come in and they can actually produce, there's like a workshop and an art studio and things like that. So they can produce things while they're institutionalized and actually sell them to the community, and often do, so that they can have some income when they leave. It's quite a nice system. And one consequence of the open campus is that the patients and the doctors all walk around kind of together. There's no dress code for one or the other. And so I was there, and I didn't speak French or German, so I kind of like felt alienated to start with, and I couldn't tell necessarily who was whom, right? And I used to do this thing where every morning I would get coffee with the director of it in her office, and then we'd maybe go out and get lunch or breakfast afterwards. So when we left her office, we'd get twice this happened. We'd get halfway down the hall, we'd maybe even be outside, and she'd turn around and be like, "Wait, did you lock my door?" And I'd be like, "What? No, of course I didn't lock your door." And she's like, visibly frustrated by the fact that I did not lock her door because I was the last person out. And I hadn't even thought about or considered or even once in my life recognized that there could be a different kind of rule for, to me, if it's your office, and maybe this is an Americanism or something, if it's her office, she is the one that's kind of responsible for guarding and locking her own door on the way out. Like, right, I'm just a research person. She's the director of the thing. It's her office. It's her responsibility. And she just fully presumed that it's the last person who walks out. And it's this simple thing, right? That's meaningless, but it's a behavioral abnormality that I was flouting. I was obviously misunderstanding this cultural thing. I also, at the time, I was quite young. I had espresso before the meal, and she's like, "What are you doing?" Right? This is from the longevity of European culture. I know better now. But these little things that I truly hadn't known about or considered were very interesting, because I then thought about, well, in what ways can I, as an outsider, detect these abnormalities amongst the Swiss and the French and German speaking people? And I couldn't at all, right? Like, everybody, basically, I was farther away from some of the patients in terms of like the whole suite of skills about what it is to be living in that society. I was actually more different than many of the patients in terms of my behavior. And I'm like, well, what is this? I was kind of like, it was prototyping being a migrant at that point, right? Like, I didn't understand the language. I didn't understand necessarily all the social cues and the tics. And I remember once looking for internet. It was back in like the internet cafe days, right? We didn't all have phones. And I went into a small little place, and I knew that sometimes the patients worked these places and sometimes it was actual employees, but I wasn't sure whom was whom. And I walked in, and a woman was like, "I like your gloves. Can I have them?" And I'm like, "You're a patient?" And then I asked the guy at the desk, I'm like, "Is there internet?" And he says, "Yeah, it's outside in the trees." And I'm like, "Oh," like, I make no light of schizophrenia or illness at all, but I was like, okay, that can't be right. But then I went outside, and there were 2 phone booths, and carved into the phone booths were 2 internet kiosks. So he was totally right. I was just misinterpreting his metaphorical usage of tree. And so I was the one who wasn't understanding language. I was the one who wasn't getting the social cues correct. I was the one who wasn't speaking the language and fitting in. And it was just so interesting to go to this place and feel more alien at a mental hospital with patients.
Yeah. So it occurs to me there's these like kind of Overton windows. There's the culture itself that has like certain like norms of acceptability, and then they vary so much from culture to culture. But then obviously within the culture, there's people's personal dispositions, and then there's outliers. But there is like a kind of norm of acceptability. Like I remember Michael Moore makes a big deal about in one of his films about Canadians leaving their doors unlocked, right? And he's like, well, we could just walk up to a house and walk in, and I'm, just have a personal disposition against locking things. I think it has to do with my wanting to break down boundaries and like be open and trusting by having a trusting disposition. So I have never seen the key to my house since the day I bought it. I remember they handed me a key and then I put it down somewhere and I've never seen it again. The door's never been locked. And then they'll say, oh, well, it's because you live in the middle of the desert. But then I lived in one of the most like dangerous areas in Venice Beach, like that was still considered the hood. And I never locked the door then either. And I remember, and I always leave my key in the ignition of the car and I never locked the car door. And then also that comes from having often had convertibles when I was younger. So I was like, why lock the door when somebody could just go over? And I remember getting in an argument with my ex-wife about this because she thought I should be locking the door. And we pulled up in her Jetta and like parked in front of our house, and I left my tripod in the back, and I locked the door because she wanted me to. And then the next morning someone had smashed the window and stolen the tripod, and it was more expensive to fix the window than to replace the tripod. And I said, you see, we should have left the door unlocked because they could have just opened the door and taken the tripod. It would have been much.
So did you really win that argument? I'm not sure.
I don't think, is it possible to win an argument like that? No, but it just shows like the importance of frames of reference. And I think disposition. I think that I think the role of disposition in political stance, for example, is under discussed and appreciated. I think people do talk about like personality traits of conservatives versus liberals, but I think it's the actual arguments for and against the position have so little to do with it, and so much more to do with belonging to a certain group and having a certain unspoken disposedness towards certain like attitudes that are never made explicit. And again, this is very Being in the World inspired, but I think it's true. Like being trusting and open to new experience obviously is a liberal, I think, disposition versus being a little bit more cautious and fear-based and mistrusting of strangers, for example, might be a conservative point of view. And both can be, you can find millions of examples to justify either position, but you're going to start with the position and then find the justifications probably.
You play a lot of chess, right? Like
yeah,
a lot of chess. Are there manners of playing that come like styles that come
absolutely
from different countries?
No, and yeah, there's people.
Are they kind of like accents? So in Go, it's very similar. So maybe we have analogous. Like I've played Go every day for many years until AlphaGo happened, and I think you also you perhaps have been addicted to chess. I've been addicted to Go in a way that has caused consternation in my romantic partners when I make coffee and just go immediately play Go instead of talk to them. But I've always been fascinated by the idea that there could be these kinds of, maybe even not like political kind of like bubbling up political philosophies in the actual style of play, but there's definitely a Japanese style, a Korean style, a Chinese style that is more than just strategy. I think about it because I think all language is also just a motor skill and learned behavior. I think about them like accents. There
was a romantic style of chess, for example, in the 1800s, along with the romantic poets and everything. And it was like these kind of extravagant gestures. And if you offered a sacrifice and the person didn't take the sacrifice, it was considered bad manners. So there's like this, because you want to be, a good sport about like engaging in the way that the other person is playing. And of course, yeah, again, there's the individual style and there's the cultural style. I imagine that there's, individuals who are more reckless and aggressive and showy versus a more calm and deliberate way of playing, like, or more methodical. And then people are always obviously trying to imagine like people from different eras playing against each other. What would win, the kind of brash arrogant style of a Bobby Fischer versus the more analytic approach of a Kasparov. Everyone's always trying to imagine the two playing against each other, but there is an upward trajectory too. People are building on the past, so probably the greatest player in the year 1880 would get absolutely crushed by one of the today's players.
So the day that the Fukushima accident actually happened, 99% of my Go playing has been online with Japanese Go players. It's a Japanese server that I would always used to log into. And the day Fukushima happened, it wasn't lost on me. You get a little picture icon of the flag, the country of origin, next to a person. And it was Fukushima. It was that night. And I noticed that there were still a bunch of people from Japan playing. And I wanted to play. And I decided, but I didn't really know what to do. I actually went through like a moral exercise of what is the proper and ethical thing to do here. This is obviously a national tragedy. This is obviously like a very difficult thing for the entire country. And my first kind of young, naive thought was, maybe I'll lose on purpose. Like I didn't feel good winning. And then I realized that I can tell how good someone is, and like if there's an anomalous move, like you're playing to a certain level and you can tell if someone dips below their skill level. If they play a move that is like many ranks below what they are, you can just tell. Yeah. And so I realized that the worst possible world would be I intentionally threw the game for some strange, for some like global pitying reason, and that they were able to detect that, and then I had violated the sanctity of the game. And so I decided, okay, that's unacceptable. And then there's two ways to kind of win and Go. You can do this like incremental win where you basically you trade 49% of the board for 51% of the board, and you win just on those margins. And it's a kind of peaceful, calm, like large scale battle. And the other is you just go all in, where it's 100 or nothing. And I have been on the other side of an all-in defeat many, many times, right? And I find it so difficult. I've actually like thrown my laptop away. I think I even punched my laptop once. Like I have a visceral, emotional, hormonal reaction to losing in that way. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to try my hardest, but I'm not going to do the explosive all or nothing way, because I don't want to cause emotional distress. And then I realized that no, I think it's very obvious that you can also detect whether or not someone is trying that style and whether or not someone is playing passively. So I decided that I was going to try my hardest. I was going to play for the purity of the game. And I think the most respectful thing to do, I hadn't thought about, maybe it was the case that people were there to distract themselves, right? And they just wanted to go back to something that wasn't melting down, which is Go. And so I had a friend who spoke Japanese, or who, this is relevant to the story, who studied it a few years in undergrad, tried to translate a sentence for me. And I said, okay, I'm about to play a whole night of Go. Can you translate the sentence for me? Please have a good game. I'm sorry for your loss. Please have a good game.
Uh-oh. I already can see where this is going to go wrong.
And so what I didn't know, speaking of cultural tics and norms, and there are multiple ways of apologizing in Japan.
Oh, okay. I thought you were going to say, I'm sorry for your loss was an arrogant way of saying like you're going to lose.
Oh, no.
That's how I thought they were going to end up interpreting it wrong. Anyway, so go ahead.
And so it turns out what I had done in Japanese, there's a kind of apology for, I'm sorry for having caused your loss versus condolences for the thing that I was not involved in having happened to you. So it's more like I'm sorry if I caused it, and then condolences if I did not. Right. And so, of course, I had chosen the I'm sorry for causing the tsunami. Please have a good game. And to this day, they gave me a nickname on the Japanese Go server, and I'm the apologizer. From that one day where I completely I flubbed this nuance of apology. And I actually think about that often now when I carve out, like, I think about the difference between jealousy and envy sometimes as you want something that someone else has, or you don't want people to have what you want. There is actually a subtle distinction between the words. Yeah. And I think I try to apply that also between I'm sorry and condolences now. I try to fork my own apologies.
Taking yourself out of it. I think there's two Buddhist sayings that I resonate with me a lot. One is, if you take the selfishness out of jealousy, you get admiration. And if you take the selfishness out of anger, you get determination. Those are things you can sit with, I think.
I like it.
I think I also would love to talk about the neuro or the physiognomy of these games. We've talked about the cultural like complex backdrops, but there's also just the pure kind of calculation going on. I've done some experiments with taking different drugs and playing chess online. So just like you're saying with Go, you have the little flag and then you have the rating, and you know that if somebody is a little higher rated than you, it's more likely than not that they're going to win. And if they have a significantly lower rating, you should easily be able to beat them. And these things are pretty consistent and well calculated, and there's not many anomalies, but there is a lot of change based on, for example, how tired you are. And I've noticed that if I'm playing somebody in Europe that has a similar rating to me, but for me it's morning and there it's evening, I know I'm going to have a little bit of a leg up on them. And then I've noticed that like coffee works really well in making you play better chess, like just as you think it would make you. It makes you very alert, right? And alcohol is just really, really bad, like for your brain. I think just I'm sure you'll be able to like back this up with some science, but this is my personal experimentation has led me to believe that like one glass of wine or being tired are just killers. But then we get into interesting stuff. So like Adderall, I tried, and it gives you a sense that you're playing better, but you're not. You're playing exactly the same, if not a little worse.
I like that.
And then, and it gives you a real false sense of confidence. Alcohol does that too, but you can feel that you're being a little more sloppy and aggressive, and you think like, and then you just miss stupid things. Whereas Adderall makes you think like, I'm seeing it all and I'm so good, but really
There's patterns in the stock market.
you're not any better. And then I've done micro doses of different psychedelics, and that's the most interesting because it's the opposite. You feel like you're grasp, but I've tried like eating a little bit of mushroom or having a 1/10 of a dose of LSD, and you think your grasp on the game is much more tenuous than you usually do, and you think I'm going to be playing so badly, and yet then you win, and then you win again, and then you think, oh well, the other person must be drunk or tired, and then you play another game, and then you're like, okay, another drunk one. How is it possible that all these people are drunk when I'm not understanding the game, and yet I'm seeing other things that they're not seeing? And I did this, and I won like 8 games in a row on a microdose of LSD. And I really think someone should do a proper study of this, because I think this kind of like sense that like your understanding is tenuous and that you don't understand anything that's happening. So it's a kind of humility that might be, but it's not so much so that it makes you insecure. You have to find it just right? And then I've also tried, just to complete the story here, I like to go to the dentist and have nitrous oxide. It makes it
You like to. It's like picnicking in the park.
it makes it a transcendental experience. Forgive the pun. No, when I discovered that there are dentists who will give you nitrous oxide if you just ask for it for a small nominal fee, it goes from being an unpleasant experience to being a highly pleasant experience. And it becomes a very philosophical journey. I think of William James and his like the varieties of religious experience, influenced by his experience with nitrous oxide. And of course, everyone thinks, oh, that burns your brain cells. But I've come back from being an hour on the tank and played chess just to see how it is, and played perfectly fine. No visible kind of detriment to my analytic skills. And so anyway, I'm curious what the neuroscientist in you can say to these very subjective experiments I've made.
Well, so what I found interesting was a few times you highlighted not like the storytelling apparatus was different, not necessarily your skill itself, but the way that you framed or thought about either your grasp on what was about to happen or your grasp on what had just happened. There's this thing called depressive realism. Have you heard of this term? So if you have people play like a Mario game, Mario style, like Nintendo, 8-bit, like jump on enemies' heads, you can have them play this for some indeterminate amount of time. Well, I guess it's determined, but indeterminate in my memory of the study. And you then ask people, like maybe a little bit after or days later or something, how many enemies they think they killed. And the default position, just like happy-go-lucky average person with no mental illness overestimates. And the question is, which category of person nails it? And it's the depressives.
Really?
It's the people with depression that are like, yeah, they're
This is very
more
depressing.
accurate.
That the depressives are actually have the accurate
Well,
assessment on what life
That's
is.
why
huh?
it's called depressive realism.
Oh
right?
God, this is terrible.
And so, the reason I thought of that was the way that you're talking about the wins and losses is what's interesting and perhaps changing. So the way that your brain is interpreting what, oh, I won because the other person must be drunk. That's a kind of fabulous story post hoc happening after the fact that is about the interpretation. It's not about the skill itself. I Twitch, right? I don't know if it still exists for our past and future listeners, but Twitch is where you can watch people play things online. It's like Amazon's little thing, right? You literally just watch other people play video games, which sounds awful, but it's not too dissimilar from just watching yourself play a video game as you play it, which is really all that happens when you play video games. And so there's a guy I watch on Twitch play Go. I don't play Go anymore since AlphaGo. It's ruined my drive and to play now that machines can just beat us at it. And he has you're not supposed to. There's like a rule in psychiatry that you're not supposed to diagnose from a distance, but I can tell the guy's got some issues, and he's a bit depressive, and maybe even bipolar. He's got some mania in there somewhere. I've watched him enough to be able to see these cycles. And the way that he describes his wins and losses is so interesting. And I've noticed that when he's depressed, he will blame an entire loss on a single mistake of his, but he will never give his opponent the credit or ability to make a mistake similarly. Mm-hmm. It's a very distorted self versus other kind of attribution error. And it's over and over and over. And it bleeds into his entire feedback mechanism because he thinks losses are his fault and he thinks wins are his fault. Like he has, and it's just so interesting.
My grandfather who taught me chess would always make fun of a friend of his who every time he lost would say, "You'll have to forgive me. I played so badly."
Yeah,
and
exactly.
it was just and it was the most infuriating thing you could say instead of like, "Oh my God, I played my best and you still beat me," or Did I interrupt?
No. I mean, it's just this idea of. I mean, I'm highlighting the fact that you said on your anecdotal data about the experience of playing chess on these drugs was about the story told.
Yes.
About the wins and losses, and this how the story's told actually feeds into like the memory and learning in the game, right? Whether or not you think that entire game was lost because of one mistake puts a priority on that single move and that single mistake.
Right.
But it could just be because your emotional state is so fucked up that you're skewing the way that you are interpreting the results and therefore misremembering it and therefore thinking that every time you lose it's your fault and every time you win it's the universe's
the depressive thing gift. The depressive thing, it reminded me of my favorite definition of the difference between an optimist and a pessimist is that the optimist thinks that this is the best of all possible worlds and the pessimist fears that that's true. And
that was darker than my thing, I think.
No, but the fact that the depressive is seeing the world accurately. When I used to suffer from anxiety attacks in my early 20s, I thought that I was in those very brief moments seeing the world as it actually is, and the rest of the time I was deluding myself. And I think still a part of me wonders if my optimism is an illusion, or in my and then there's the idea that. Yeah, I mean, we talk about the mood in the room, right? Is that just something that's just like you seeing it through a certain filter, or is there a mood does it make sense to have an optimistic disposition versus a pessimistic disposition? It's like what we're talking about political views. You can always find rationalization for either, but so then you have to say, and this goes to our free will debate yesterday, like. People always say, "Oh, Tao, it's so great that you have such a optimistic disposition and that you always see the best in things and in people and everything." I say, "Yeah, but I don't get credit for that. I just happen to be born this way." And of course, I'm happy that I cultivate it and I try and use my optimism to live a better life, and it opens opportunities. But I didn't choose the part of me that does that either. So I just feel lucky that I have that kind of stance. I have my brother who had the same upbringing as I did, is a much has a much more pessimistic view on things, and he doesn't feel as lucky. I remember he had a terrible car accident, and everyone said, "Oh, you're so lucky to have survived," and he'd be like, "No, you're lucky that you didn't have the accident." So it's like there was a study I read once about the difference between people who feel lucky and people who feel unlucky, and did you know this?
No, but I want to know.
And people who feel, the unlucky ones are accident prone, and the lucky ones feel like they're always getting, away with things. And Dreyfus was famous for his luck and would actually factor it into his decision making often, because he was so confident in it as well. Just, I'm a lucky person, so I know that I can do this, and and so like the study, they gave people a mocked up newspaper, and they asked people to count how many images are in the newspaper, and the unlucky people on average took 4 minutes and 30 seconds to count the images, and the lucky people took 4 seconds. And why the huge spread is because as soon as you opened the paper, there was a big headline that said you can stop counting. There's 38 images in the paper. And almost without fail, the people who considered themselves lucky were the ones who weren't just doing exactly what they were told, but they were like looking outside of the task and the box, and they would see that.
So the unlucky ones started on page 1 and didn't go off it.
Yeah, just started counting and didn't look at the headline.
Okay, got it.
Whereas it was like 2 seconds later, you opened the paper and the answer was there, but it wasn't within the specific task.
Interesting. So maybe luckiness is a kind of like explore exploit trade-off thing. So I mean, this is very common in nature. You have very like ants all the way up to fish, to mammals, to herons that are searching and things. You have this like, for a given set of resources, there's a tendency to explore. If it's you're unsatisfied with the amount of resources you have, and once you find a little pocket, you then switch into exploit mode. And there's all kinds of like game theory and mathematical models of like if you search, I think it's like a finite grid of random but reoccurring resources. So this could be, for example, a patch of ocean which has schools of fish that are reoccurring, but they're somewhat random in how they appear within that grid. You'll have birds like herons search in a very specific pattern called a levee flight, and that is the explore exploit kind of trade-off, the mathematical model, where they'll spend a lot of time exploiting a patch if they do find a patch of fish, and then make random jumps to explore other areas. And you can do this, of course, with just like information and knowledge as well. And so you probably end up with different kinds of explore exploit, like personality profiles. Yeah. And I imagine maybe the lucky ones there. My interpretation of what you just said was that the lucky ones are exploring very quickly.
Yes. Yeah. And then the article ended with one of the lucky ones came into the study. It was an ongoing study, and they had like fallen down the stairs and broken their leg. And they came in with a cast, and the researcher said, "Okay, now you can't consider yourself lucky. Look, you broke your leg." And the person looked up smiling and said, "Are you kidding? I could have broken my neck." So that was a great way of just closing with saying it's so much to do with our perspective and our attitude towards things too.
I love that the theme of this was like how we understand and tell the story of something that just happened to us and the different versions of this. So how do we remember this podcast? What's the story of this podcast? We're playing a game. We're playing a linguistic game of back and forth, a turn-based linguistic game of back and forth, like chess or like Go. It's just language instead of these finite state moves.
And we came in with no rules and no plan, and yet we have a style and a banter and a way of like just diving in, and a faith, I think, that things are going to work out okay. I think, I mean, we talked about this, like people who do, and I find this in documentary filmmaking too. Like, I think there's a way of being prepared. If I'm going to interview someone, it's much more important to read their book, for example, than to make a list of questions, like
100%.
Having a more broad-based understanding of what their life is about, and an openness to just listen to the person talk about what they want to talk about. And I've seen it a lot in young filmmakers who've come to interview me for something, and they have over-prepared, and they have like a rigidity about the questions they want to ask. And then it's no longer a dialogue, and it's not interesting. There's no surprises. It's trying to box you into saying certain things. And so I think it goes back to the idea of mastery being to do with responding to the unique situation and having a broad-based skill, understanding and skill in the domain versus following rules which by their very nature are don't apply to the specific situation but apply to all situations and therefore are less I don't know, just this work less well, right?
Yeah.
You see that in people who just are learning to drive, and it says like, oh, shift gears at 3,000 revs, and for those few of you who still know how to drive, stick shift. But then it's such a difference between that and just feeling it, because then when you're going uphill, it's different, and when you're coasting a downhill or you're going into a turn, and you can't possibly make all these rules explicit. There would just be an infinite number of them. Should we wrap on that?
Sure. I think we jumped on 65 enemy heads in the course of this conversation.
In what sense?
Intellectual enemies that we vanquished in the course of this conversation.
with the fact that they couldn't defend themselves too. It's so easy, right?
Yeah. I'm doing the depressive realism study right now. You have to say how many you think we vanquished.
All of them.
Fucking Pollyanna. Bullshit.
Okay. See you tomorrow.